I can see there's another person in the queue. And so who is that?
I think it's me. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Yeah, hi. My name's Lee Stranahan. Who are you?
Hi, I'm Craig Murray here in Edinburgh.
Oh my gosh, it's Craig Murray. This is an honor. It's very good to talk to you, Mr. Murray. How are you?
Oh, very nice to join you. I'm very good, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I have a lot of stuff to talk to Craig Murray about because I'm a big follower of yours, and I was in the UK a couple months ago after I went to cover the Putin-Trump meeting in Helsinki. I went and I had dinner with our mutual acquaintance, George Galloway. And we were talking about you and just the great, I love reading your feed. One of the things that I had done the night before was I actually went to Salisbury to cover that story and the Skripal poisoning story. And I just think you've done, I highly recommend your Twitter feed to anybody trying to figure out the other side of the narrative on a lot of this stuff that I consider very, very important stories. So it's a real pleasure to talk to you.
No, thank you. It's good to talk to you as well. And yes, I've known George since I was a student. I've known George a very long while, both in Dundee. But
wow.
So, you know, we have a difference of opinion on British politics because I'm very much in favour of Scottish independence and George isn't. But it doesn't get in the way of our friendship and our working together for mutual causes.
Yeah, no, and I'm in a, you know, I'm an American Republican who was, you know, friends with Steve Bannon. So George and I, as you might imagine, disagree on some things, but you know, as I say, there's this interesting ideological cross-partisan split right now, where people who are libertarian, green, Republican, Democrat, Tory, Labor, who are anti-war are all kind of finding each other, and who are anti-war and anti the intelligence community's outrageous intrusions on people's civil liberties and control of foreign policy, and are in favor of free speech. And these events, I think, are great at bringing those people together.
I think that's very true. I think left and right is still an important dividing line in politics, but I think the libertarian authoritarian divide has become more important in a sense. And I'm, if you like, a left libertarian. That might be a good way of putting it. But the deeply distrustful of the ever increasing power of the state, and that has become in many ways the most important dividing line in politics today.
Well, no. So talk about, first off, just sort of, I assume people know what your history is, but talk about some of your history with WikiLeaks, because I find this part fascinating too. Since I'm sort of a fanboy of WikiLeaks, where I've never met Assange or anything like that, and so I sort of watch from afar as a journalist who appreciates the work. But talk about some of your history.
Well, with WikiLeaks, my history is actually quite strange because I was a career diplomat. I was in the British Foreign Office for over 20 years. I was ambassador at what was for the UK at a very young age. And I became disenchanted with what we were doing in the war on terror, and particularly with torture and extraordinary rendition, as well as the war in Iraq. And I decided to blow the whistle. And in doing so, to release some documents to prove that what I was saying was true, particularly about British complicity in torture and extraordinary rendition. And I hadn't heard of WikiLeaks at the time. But I decided myself that rather than go to a newspaper, which puts you in the hands of the newspaper and the people that control it, that I would release my documents myself online, which was quite radical back in 2005, which I did. And somebody suggested to me I should get them to WikiLeaks and get WikiLeaks to release them. And I tried that, and actually WikiLeaks refused to release them because they said they didn't know who I was, and I'd been in the Foreign Office for more than 20 years, and they weren't sure if they could trust me, and they couldn't independently verify the authenticity of the documents. So my first experience with WikiLeaks was them thinking I might be some kind of agent of the British state. And so my initial contacts with them weren't terrifically promising. As time went on.
Well, let me just make, I just like to bookmark was one point there, because I think it's important to understand that WikiLeaks is not simply taking material and putting it out without, one of the things I appreciate as a journalist about WikiLeaks is their selectivity. So I just wanted to make that point as one of the things that I like about WikiLeaks.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. And, you know, they had a reasonable suspicion of somebody who'd been quite a high-level insider who suddenly claimed to be coming and blowing the whistle.
Yes.
And that's fine. And you're right. I mean, the fact that they have 100% accuracy record means they have undoubtedly knocked back over the years a good deal of the material that was authentic, but that they haven't published, because that's the only way you can maintain 100% accuracy record.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
So yes, I mean, I think that's very important. They are a publisher, and Julian is an editor, and that means they don't just churn everything they get, and that's a very, very important thing to note.
Yes, and so after that starting off weird thing, you're rejected by WikiLeaks, and so then what happened? And again, this is your 2005, correct?
That's right. Yeah. After that, I was awarded the Sam Adams Award by the Sam Adams Associate, by Ray McGovern and Bill Binney et al. In 2005, I think. And then a couple of years later, when it was awarded by Julian Assange, it was awarded to Julian Assange, and the ceremony to give it to him was held in London at a very large press event which WikiLeaks had on. And that was at the time of the release of their collateral murder video, when WikiLeaks were really extremely high profile. And I presented the award to Julian along with Daniel Ellsberg.
Wow.
And that was the first time I'd actually met Julian in the flesh. Was in presenting him that award. And of course, it was very shortly after that, that a matter of weeks after that, that these allegations emerged from Sweden, and he was arrested. So my association with Julian and with WikiLeaks really started then. But I've never, and it's important to say because people sometimes get this wrong, I'm not actually a member of the organization at all. I'm not part of WikiLeaks. I'm a friend of WikiLeaks, and I have the honor to be something of a friend of Julian. But I've never actually joined the organization. I don't have a role within the organization as such. I'm just a whistleblower and supporter.
No, but still though, I just think that first off, it's such a great story, your story, and like you said, getting turned down by WikiLeaks, and then a couple of years later, when Julian gets the award you'd gotten a couple of years before, Julian had to be going, "Oh, I should have published that." But now recently, what's been on your mind recently? I'll let you lay it out, because I follow your Twitter feed. What do you think the most important story in the world is right now?
Well, I still think the Skripal story is extremely important. We haven't got to the bottom of it yet. I had a kind of early into the story when, within the first week, when Boris Johnson's Foreign Secretary came out and said it was the Russians that did it, and it was a Russian nerve agent. I had a contact from within the Foreign Office, because remember, I was an ambassador and I worked there for over 20 years. So I had many friends who were there. You know, you can't work somewhere for more than 20 years and not make friends, unless you're a particularly unpleasant person. But
Well, I was going to say, ask Steve Bannon about that. Gus doesn't seem to have many in the White House anymore, but
no, I had a good many friends who are still friends who work there.
Okay, good.
And, somebody contacted me who was very worried and said there was great concern that Boris Johnson had, gone on television and blamed the Russians and had stated that this nerve agent was made in Russia, whereas in fact the scientists from Porton Down had not been able to say where it was made. But he also said more than that. He said that the scientists at Porton Down had been put under enormous pressure to say that it was made in Russia, but had refused to do so as a matter of their own professional integrity. They had not bowed down to that pressure and had refused to do so. And then they, of course, the scientists themselves don't attend government meetings because you don't have scientists at government meetings, but at top-level meetings in Whitehall, where the head of their agency had been present, a formula had been negotiated whereby the government, in all its official statements, would say that that it was a nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. And it turned out, the chap told me this and I published it. And subsequently, the government continually used this phrase of a type developed by Russia. And the European Union then issued a statement saying it was of a type developed by Russia. And the British made a statement to the Security Council using exactly the same formulation of a type developed by Russia. And eventually, about a week later, Sky News, I think it was, interviewed the head of Porton Down Chemical Weapons Establishment, who had analysed it. And he said, he confirmed, because they asked him directly, that they could not say that the chemical was made in Russia. And so I was, if you like, I was proven to be telling the truth, because I said all that exactly as it subsequently happened. And at the time I said it, I came in for massive abuse, particularly from corporate media journalists. Quite literally scores of corporate media and BBC journalists were mocking me on television and calling me a Russian agent and saying that I couldn't possibly have really had this information. And it was actually quite a difficult time. I very seldom had such a sort of tirade of abuse. But subsequently, I was shown to be precisely right, and my source had been telling the truth. And to this day, nobody has been able to say where that chemical was actually made.
Well,
and that's an important fact, but a fact which the press continue to try to ignore, and they continue to call it a Russian Novichok, which makes no sense at all.
Well, no, that's right, and we've also had. And it wasn't just you; it was you, and you suffered, but also people like the professor Piers Robinson and that group of people who were talking about the Duma supposed chemical weapons attack that happened around the same time as the Skripal attack. They were attacked again. Your Russian agents, everything else. For basically, to me, the Duma attack and the Skripal attack were very similar in that a supposed chemical attack happens, and they immediately jump to the penalty phase before they'd actually done the investigation. Immediately, we're going to take action against Russia, really in both cases, in Syria, but also Russia in the case of Syria, and Russia directly in the case of the Skripal case. But let me ask you something, because you also been in the story about, and this will be dense if people have not been following the Sergei Skripal story. I will be selfish and say I wrote a really good piece about it for Sputnik a couple of weeks ago, and I'll relink to that on my Twitter feed but I want to ask you, Craig, a question, because you know it quite well. First off, Orbis is the company that Christopher Steele was part of that was behind the Steele dossier, but more significantly for our purposes here, he got his in by doing reports on Ukraine that went to Victoria Nuland. That's Steele's, that's how he got involved subsequently in the Steele dossier, was through connections he had with Jonathan Weiner, former State Department official. that came from giving those reports in Ukraine. Now, Orbis is Christopher Steele's company. There's a guy there named Pablo Miller, who there was a D notice sent out to British broadcasters about quickly. He's a partner in Orbis, and he was Sergei Skripal's recruiter. And Skripal, when the story first broke, everyone was like, well, he hasn't been doing anything. Turns out, you found out that the BBC has been interviewing him, correct?
That's right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Miller also worked for Orbis, and Miller was working for Orbis at the time that Steele was producing the dossier on Trump. And I should say, and I think this is a very important thing to say, that I read MI6 reports coming out of Moscow over a long period of my career. And MI6 never had the detailed access from high-level contacts that Christopher Steele claims to have in that dossier. And the idea that Steele didn't have those contacts when he was ahead of the MI6 station and living in Moscow, and that a decade later, having not been able to go to Moscow for the previous decade, suddenly he had better contacts in Moscow than MI6 have. It was just nonsense. Any intelligence professional knows that the Steele dossier is nonsense. But he had to get information from somewhere, and he got some of it from the Ukraine. He got some of it from Pablo Miller, who had worked in Moscow more recently than he had. And I am 99% certain that he got some of it from Skripal, because he definitely got some of it from Miller. And Miller, who was Skripal's MI6 handler,
and who lived in Salisbury, right? Who lived very close.
Exactly. He lived half a mile from Skripal. Right. Had been his handler in Moscow. And then they'd gone to live in the same small. Salisbury is a city, but you should understand it's a city of 40,000 people. It's not a. It's not a big city.
It's a small city. Yeah, it's right near Stonehenge. It's about 15 minutes from Stonehenge, and there's a mill, and there's a nice goose.
So I think almost certainly some of the detail added into the Steele dossier to try to make it sound. To make it sound convincing to a non-expert, would have been put in there by Skripal, some of the details of committees and that kind of thing. And yes, Mark Urban of the BBC, who had been an officer in the Royal Tank Regiment together with Miller, who'd actually joined the Royal Tank Regiment on the same day as Miller, at the same rank. Mark Urban had been down several times in the year before the Skripal poisoning and interviewed Skripal, Mark Urban being one of the BBC's main diplomatic reporters. And the BBC hid that for 4 months after the attack. They even when the Skripal attack was the biggest world news item going, it was leading bulletins all over the world, the BBC hid the fact that their diplomatic editor had been meeting him for the past year before the attack. And that's astonishing when you think about it. And it's astonishing from Urban's part. If you're a journalist, what a career break. This guy gets bumped off. The whole world is talking about it. And you're the only journalist who's been meeting him for the past year. Wouldn't you tell the world? Why would you hide that?
BBC exclusive. Yeah, our interviews. You're exactly right. I always say it's from, it's Sherlock Holmes, the dog that didn't bark. Always listen carefully to what the media doesn't tell you. When you find out the stuff they're not telling you, that's the stuff to listen to, because you're right.
And also the fact that the government immediately issued not one but 2 D notices banning the media, which they can do here, from any mention of Miller. And so that tells you, when the government tells you there's something you're not allowed to mention, that's the heart of the story. And I think I am very largely convinced that Skripal's involvement in the Steele dossier is the main motive behind what happened in Salisbury. Exactly how that plays out, I don't know. I mean, that doesn't tell you who did it, but it gives you a much more plausible motive the idea that Putin did it because of something that happened in Moscow 12 years ago, which Skripal had already been jailed for and which Putin let him out of jail. The idea Putin then changed his mind and turned around and decided to kill him years later for something that happened 12 years ago is just not plausible.
Right before the World Cup, too. Right before.
That was just not likely. Whereas the Steele dossier is still, and the Mueller, which feeds into the Mueller investigation and feeds into what is big now, that's much, much more plausible. That's a much more likely explanation as to why something would happen. And if you ask me my own view, and I don't know, and I really, nobody knows, but the most plausible of several possible explanations I can think of is that this made Skripal a loose end.
Yes.
And Skripal, remember, is not a trustworthy person. He's somebody who sold for cash the names of agents of his own country to the British. He's a traitor. And it doesn't matter.
Not for ideology, it was for money. It was purely for money.
Purely for cash. Yeah.
Yes.
For cash.
Yeah.
He sold the name. And if you've compiled a dossier which is big news and there's big money involved, and a lot of that dossier is nonsense, and one of the guys who helped you write the nonsense is somebody with a long history of selling out stories for cash, you're going to be worried he's going to sell out that story for cash. In my mind, the most likely motive for anybody to attack Skripal is to stop him selling the story of his involvement in the Steele dossier. I can't think of any motive more likely than that. Now, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm not saying that's 100% true, but that seems to me the most probable explanation of what's going on here.
It's clearly an area 100% that needs to be investigated, and there's no one investigating it. Either journalistically, but preferably some external organization looking at this theory, because it certainly makes more sense than the theory that the British and then the US were subsequently putting out about Putin's motivation for doing it. It makes a lot more sense. But let me add two things to it. Number one, and Galloway's reported this, so I'm not speaking out of school. George Galloway, when right after I visited him in the UK, right before I visited him, he'd been at an event the night before, and he talked to a military person, a real person. I'll put it like that, a real military person. And he mentioned something about the Skripal thing, and the military guy came up to Galloway and said, "Who do you think did Skripal?" And Galloway said, "My guess is it was maybe Russian mafia." And the military guy leaned over and said, "Ukrainians," and walked away. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. But what it means is it confirms what I think, which is Ukrainian involvement is likely. And I will say this. I recently interviewed Andrei Teleshenko. Andrei Teleshenko was the person at the Ukrainian embassy in Washington who was coordinating with campaigns in 2016. He's a loyal Ukrainian, not pro-Russian, not pro-Putin, not that guy at all. And he was a whistleblower for Ukrainian DNC collusion, where a DNC operative came over to the Ukrainian embassy and he was told, work with her, don't talk to Trump. That was all reported by Politico a year ago. What he told me was, Teleshenko's a serious guy, worked in government, part of the Maidan. He told me he personally knows someone in Kiev who was told by Orbis to just make stuff up for the Steele dossier. He submitted research and they said, this isn't good enough. We need something more. And the guy said, well, you're paying me to research. They said, just make it up off your head. And that was told to me by Andrei Teleshenko. And he knows who that person is, obviously. And that person's afraid now. And they worked with Soros's International Renaissance over there. And so that's, to me, another piece of this puzzle, is that there's clear connections between Orbis and Ukraine. We know that. And everywhere I look in all of these stories, whether it's the DNC hack, that malware that they say was used is Ukrainian malware. It's an older version of Ukrainian malware. It's not Russian. And everywhere I looked in this, I notice stuff where I go, well, Ukraine's got a big hacking community as well. They have the motive to do a lot of this stuff, and that's an area I've been pursuing. I don't have all the links because you're going from public information, and you can only do what you can do. But when I look at the Skripal thing, it all starts to make sense as part of a wider pattern of them working with Steele, the clear involvement of people like John McCain's assistant, David Kramer, who McCain flew over to meet with on the Steele dossier. He's connected with every organization. McCain, of course, was a big advocate of the Maidan and blah, blah, blah. And so when I look at all the players and how they work together, there's a story that makes sense that nobody in the media is talking about, but that someone like you understand a lot of what I'm talking about here and who these names are. But a guy like Jonathan Weiner, nobody knows who he is.
No, but it's also particularly interesting to me because, as you know, I was British ambassador in Uzbekistan, and Uzbekistan is where the chemical weapons were tested during the Soviet Union, and of course, when people talk, historically, there's been a lot of talk of Russia developing these weapons back in the 80s. Well, it was the Soviet Union in the 80s. It wasn't Russia in the 80s. And I visited the facility in Nukus. The facility in Nukus where these weapons were tested, which is in the Karakum Desert, quite a long way from anywhere. But that facility was actually dismantled by the Americans around 2000. And I went to a party, funnily enough, hosted by the UN, I think. But I went to a party in Tashkent for the completion of the dismantling of the system. And a lot of the equipment and laboratory records were taken back to the United States. But I visited the labs themselves when I visited Nukus a few months later. And when I visited the labs, there wasn't much there. They were dismantled. But I met some of the Soviet scientists were still kicking around, having been rather abandoned there. And one of the things I learned was that the largest community of scientists, the largest nationality of scientists who'd been working on the chemical weapons program were Ukrainians. They were the biggest, and there was still quite a Ukrainian community in Nukus, and there is today a very large half-Ukrainian community in Nukus, because lots of people married there or whatever. Not only them, there was after the Ukrainians, Russians were probably second after Ukrainians as the next largest ethnicity involved at Nukus, and after that, Georgians. And so, Ukraine, Georgia certainly knew and had the capacity to make these things beyond any doubt whatsoever. The guy who has been interviewed a lot, who published the book about Novichok, who now lives in the United States, he's actually an Armenian, even though described as Russian in all the newspapers. He's not Russian at all. He's Armenian.
That's interesting.
So, there are basically almost all the countries, certainly Uzbeks, almost all the countries of the former Soviet Union were participating in that program. But the biggest single number of scientists there were Ukrainians. So Ukraine undoubtedly has the technical ability to concoct these things. But I mean, I think it was David Collin, professor at Columbia University, who said that any of his graduate students could do it. It's not the actual production of a chemical is not in itself the key point. But Ukrainian link, no, there definitely is one.
Well, no, and Novichok, of course, is that's a Western name. Novichok, it sounds like something out of, the language that Burroughs created for Clockwork Orange, where it's kind of a lot of Russian idioms mixed in. Novichok, but it's like A233 or something is the actual, which is not as Russian sounding. And but the guy who you mentioned who wrote the book, it's $8 on Amazon, and it lists the formula for what we refer to as Novichok. It's right there in the book. Yet even this recent round of stories after Don Burgess died, and this last second poisoning in Salisbury, I'm still seeing stories that could have only been created in Russia, and they're quoting the guy who's in other interviews said, well, anybody could have created it. So you're right. I mean, it was not a difficult. The whole story is ginned up. I don't know how else to say it, but even down to the name and I've seen so many false flags like that this year. It used to be they'd spread out the false flags a little bit, where you get a little bit of breathing room between, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and the next thing. But now they're bunching them all up with Duma and with the Skripal thing. So when you look at this stuff from your role being in the Foreign Service, the other thing is, I don't know if you can speak to this. I asked John Kiriakou about it, the former CIA agent. I said, how's the tradecraft on this stuff? Like, would your idea have been to leave a poison traceable to you on someone's outer doorknob? Would you have gotten a promotion for that plan? Or it just seems like horrible tradecraft.
It actually seems just appalling. I mean, what's even more unbelievable from the point of view of tradecraft is the idea, and apparently what the story now is, that they put the stuff on the doorknob out of a perfume bottle, which is a strange way to apply a gel, but there you are. And then they put the gel back in the bottle and sealed it up and carefully re-cellophaned it so it looked new. And then, and the Skripals lived on the outskirts of Salisbury. Then they travelled back into Salisbury, into the centre of Salisbury, and left the poison behind somewhere in its perfume bottle, right in the middle of Salisbury, where, despite the entire British Army and police searching for 4 months, nobody found it. Except for poor, the unfortunate lady who was killed and her partner, Charlie Rowley. But this is just such complete nonsense. But from 2 points, firstly, from a tradecraft point of view, you would never just leave it behind to be found. You're
right.
talking about allegedly trained professional assassins.
Right. And so also, by the way, a good way when you know where the guy's house is, another good way is just a bullet. I don't know if they've heard this. Boom, right between the eyes. That tends to work and send a message. But you know what I'm saying? Like there's ways to kill people that are actually 100% effective. And this plan was not one of them, apparently.
No. And if you're going to apply it to a doorknob, you would need at the time, whoever's applying it to the doorknob needs to be wearing one of his big chemical weapons suits. You can't just wander around and spray it over the place and not get affected yourself. Right. And someone would have noticed. Nobody saw anything, apparently. That's all very, very improbable. And the idea that then the stuff, it stayed there. And the poor chap, Charlie Rowley, who discovered it,
yes,
4 months after, he says that the perfume was in a sealed packet and he had to take off the cellophane. Well, this makes no sense whatsoever. And yet the police are saying definitively it was the same bottle, the same batch, the same bottle, that's where it came from. So the idea that you'd seal it back and disguise it as a new bottle of perfume and then leave it somewhere where 4 months later, and it must have been somewhere indoors, because when the guy found it, he thought it was brand new and he gave it as a present to his girlfriend. So it hadn't been sitting in a bin or something for 4 months. It had been somewhere where it was kept looking pristine. The whole story makes no sense whatsoever. It makes absolutely no sense to anybody.
Yeah, and I do think that's one of the things said. John, I want to make sure we talk about Julian Assange too. But this is where in this story, a guy like Assange, I've said this before and I mean it. One of the hardest things to me about having Assange incommunicado is so many things have happened that I would have wanted to hear Assange's voice on. I would have wanted to hear what he thought of it or what his analysis was. That's been one of the toughest things. If you think about it, I think was any part of this, I don't think any part of the Skripal case was happening how long has Assange been incommunicado now?
Yeah, no, it pretty well coincides. Yeah, it pretty
Yeah.
well coincides.
This was the Skripal case started March 4th, but didn't get reported about March 8th. So but that's a really significant, and I said this at the time, I know the Duma attack, the stuff with North Korea, there's been so much legitimate news in the news cycle, and not having Assange's voice on it is just very, especially when he's still with us. You know?
I very definitely agree with that, and it's a massive loss. But on the other hand, his influence in society is all pervasive now. He's had a massive effect on belief in governments. Let me put it that way. In your last discussion, you were talking about how opinion polls show that trust in institutions has fallen, and I'm very glad to say that Julian in particular has been a major part of why people no longer trust the media. They no longer trust what they are told. And one thing about the Skripal story has been quite extraordinary. It's hard to describe it properly, but a sort of wave of popular disbelief.
Yes.
The number of people who buy the official Skripal story is surprisingly small, given that it's been pumped out non-stop, unquestioningly by all the media.
When I went to Salisbury, I didn't meet one person. I talked to about 16 people. I didn't meet one person who believed the story. The closest someone got was they said, well, Russia may have done it, but then we may have, the British. He said, but then we may have done it. That was as close as anybody got. Everybody else was like, no, I don't believe it. And that's in Salisbury, where people should be aware. When I was there, like I say, mid-July, that whole park was still blocked off. All the buildings, Zizzy Pizza, where they ate, still blocked off, guarded 24/7 by police who were brought in from out of the region, by the way, which may make sense, but it's interesting, who don't know anything about it and who are just guarding this stuff. And that Zizzy Pizza, where they thought they might have been poisoned, is right next to a supermarket. Literally, it's it's connected to a supermarket, which is wide open. So you'd think if there's a nerve agent in the pizza place, they might go, well, maybe we should close the Tesco down, but that would be really bad for business. And they don't seem to want to do that. So when I talk to people in Salisbury, no one's been reporting on it. No one's been there. When it first happened, the media showed up. They said the stuff they were supposed to say. Then they left town. And now they don't see, there's no investigative anybody out there.
No, that's true. And the Zizi thing is fascinating in a way as well, because, the whole story, it's more of a story that doesn't make sense. The idea that they touched the doorknob, they both touched the doorknob and closing a door, which is strange. They were then perfectly well and fine for 5 hours, including well enough to eat a good meal, so they weren't feeling bad. Then they were suddenly both struck down instantaneously. But not only that, they apparently, they touched the doorknob, so they got the stuff on their hands. And somehow the table itself that they ate at had to be destroyed because it was so contaminated. But what about the glasses and the cutlery and why weren't none of the waiters? If you've got nerve agents all over your hands and you're drinking from a glass, and the waiter picks up the glass and walks away with it, why did nothing happen to the waiter? The whole ZZ angle to it. There's so much that there's just complete and utter nonsense in the story about the whole thing's being handled.
It just doesn't make sense. And that's why the locals, that's why I was so curious talking to people I was talking to people right where the pizza place is, right where the mill is, that whole area right in downtown. And just nobody, and these were all locals. I talked to people who were from there. And I wish I'd been able to spend more time there, because I'm sure there's a lot. I would want to talk to the people you're talking about, the wait staff at the pizza place, because I've heard Skripal was very agitated and in a hurry and yelling that his risotto took 20 minutes, which I don't know if he's heard of risotto before, but that's not bad. I'm just saying you don't order risotto if you're in a hurry. That's not a quick meal. You order I'll take that slice of pizza. But apparently he was agitated and was being a jerk to the waiter. I'm sure you've read that stuff. And I don't know what it means, but what I know is nobody seems to be investigating it, you know?
No, the lack of investigative reporting has been. We don't have investigative reporters anymore. I mean, I don't know. And I would say, I mean, for people listening in the States, you know, Salisbury is a garrison town. The British military and Portendown itself, the chemical weapons establishment, those are major employers. It's a garrison town. So you're talking of, you know, the American comparison would be to be asking people in a garrison town in Florida. And if people there don't believe the government, they're not going to believe the government anywhere.
Right. And then again, this was after the Burgess Rowley poisoning. I saw Burgess's house. I talked to people who knew Don Burgess. Yeah. The shopkeeper across the way where she was an alcoholic, but she used to buy alcohol there. But that doesn't, I don't say that. I've had plenty of friends who are alcoholics, and I'm not commenting on that. I'm saying this is somebody who talked to her all the time, said she was nice, you know what I mean? Said always pleasant and everything like that. But I saw right where her house was. And this guy, once again, it was another one who was like, there's something wrong with the story. Everybody I talked to, they know something's wrong. And that's why I, from, you know, across the Atlantic, wanted to go there to just see. Because I'll be honest, if I'd gone there and everybody had been like, look, it's obviously Russia because they knew something, that's what I'd report. But nobody said that. So.
And most people, and it isn't, I mean, we do need more than ever now people to leak. You know, we need whistleblowers from inside to know what's happening here, because we're in a situation where what's being ramped up is a new Cold War, with the threat of it escalating into a new hot war, especially what's happening in the Middle East. So this is a fundamental danger to humanity. You know, we need people to come forward on the inside now, and that's where WikiLeaks can play such an important part. We need somebody to come out who knows what's happening on the inside and let us know. I had that chap phone me up from a foreign office at an early stage and tip me off about the fake attribution to Russia, and that was extremely helpful. But I've not actually myself had anyone since. We need people to come forward to WikiLeaks, and if anyone's thinking of doing it, you know, there's no more important time than this. The world is in a febrile condition at the moment. And
I've said this too about the Julian thing. People need to say this is a shot against. What they're doing to Julian Assange was a shot against the bow to every journalist in the world. It is a warning. We'll do this to you, right? Step out of line, step out of bounds. This is what we can do to you too. And I will be honest with you, as a journalist working on big stories, it's crossed my mind that if they can do this to Julian Assange, right, there's nothing keeping them on any journalist of bringing charges on. They'll find something. Don't worry. They'll find something. It doesn't make any difference what it would be on if they're going to do this. And the fact that so few journalists have spoken up in favor of Julian Assange, these Unity for J things, I shouldn't be on here at all, because it should be filled with Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward and Anderson Cooper and whoever else people know. Much more famous journalists should be coming on and going, you know, as a major famous journalistic icon, I support Julian Assange. None of them. It is absolutely shameful. You know, you can count on one hand the well-known journalists. We know people like Ellsberg, for instance, have spoken up, but so few. And where's the journalistic where's the professors of journalism? Where's the people? Even just that, how many journalism teachers are there in the States, right? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, right? Nothing from them, and no organized student actions or anything like that. So that's part of what's disturbing to me. But the good thing is I see these Unity for J things growing, and I love the dialogue format, and it's been a real pleasure to be able to talk to you. It's really an honor, because like I say, following your stuff, you're one of the people that gets it on the Skripal story in a very deep way, and I appreciate being able to talk to you.
No, thank you. It's been good to meet you as well. I had a little thing pop up above my screen there saying we should explain what's going to happen next, which is fun because I have no idea what's going to happen next.
I don't either. What's going to happen next, I assume, is, and if they're telling me, that's why I was just looking at my phone because I'm like, are they going to tell me what to do? Wait, what's that?
Good evening.
Oh, look who it is.
Hi, how are you, Lee?
Craig just got, hey, how you doing? So nice to see you.
I've been sitting here quite scintillated, actually, watching all of the time that you've been on stream, Lee, and I have so much feedback for you about what the things that you are saying. But I also wanted to say personally hi to Craig Murray because it is really special to have you here with us.
Hi, Susie. Very happy to be here and support Julian.
I wanted to ask you a couple of quick questions, Craig. I was actually supposed to come in about 20 minutes ago, but I knew how excited Lee was to get to talk to you, and I knew how closely he'd been following your work. So I enjoyed actually sitting here and watching the interaction between you. But Craig, I wanted to ask you about the last time that you saw Julian at the embassy. When was that? What condition was he in? But more importantly, having visited him over the span of years, I'm interested to know, have you noticed a physical deterioration from the impacts on him of his arbitrary detention?
Yeah, it's a good question. I saw him a couple of times early this year. I can't remember the precise dates off the top of my head. We had a long talk, and we talked for some hours. Standing in the kitchen of the embassy, in fact, which is a very, very small kitchen. And the last couple of times I've seen Julian are the only times I've really worried about him and his physical condition. I mean, I definitely noted a deterioration that I hadn't noted before. I'd seen, for years, I'd seen various reports of him having various complaints and tooth problems and back problems and muscle problems and various things, but he always made light of them. He always looked fine. But the last couple of times I met him, I left worried about him and worried that he really was not well, and worried not both about his physical condition, because you can't be locked away from sunlight and from all exercise for that many years and it have no effect, but also worried about the effect on his mental health of continued incarceration in a very small area, and that was, of course, before he was effectively put into isolation. So things would have become much worse since then. And the last time I met him, I was expecting to go and see him again a few weeks later. We weren't sort of saying goodbye, not expecting to see each other again for months. So no, I really am very worried about him indeed, both his physical health and his mental health.
I think it's absolutely horrific what is happening to him, and if it's having if any good is coming from it, I think it's that people are finally starting to understand how serious the situation is. And I think that people who may have taken for granted his fortitude to date are starting to understand that if we don't take some action, if we do not unite to put pressure on the governments who are persecuting him, that we do stand at serious risk of losing him. Do you agree with that?
I've been taken aback by how extremely vicious, not just the British state, but the British establishment is towards him, and by the continued extremely callous nature of some of the comments towards him. One example of it, of course, was in the last court hearing that was held on the bail question, where Judge Arbuthnot, lady who's married to a Conservative minister, and a Conservative minister whose husband, a Conservative minister who she's married to a Conservative minister who had an intelligence company jointly with the head of MI6. The judge, that judge, made so-called humorous remarks about how he could take exercise on the balcony of the embassy, and the balcony of the embassy has a floor space of about 2 meters by about 75 centimeters. That's the floor area of the balcony, and he doesn't have access to it. He has access to it about once a year. And she also made a throwaway remark about how he could get plenty of medical attention if he went to Wandsworth Prison. And Wandsworth Prison is a particularly nasty and unpleasant jail in the UK. And that kind of nasty callousness, I found repeated an awful lot. And I don't think we are going to find any humanitarianism in the British establishment, in the British legal system or the British media. Whether there is, I sense there is a change of view among a lot of the British public. And the people are becoming more aware of the acuteness of this plight, and are feeling more sympathetic towards him. I don't expect that to have any impact on government. I think Julian is viewed as an enemy of the state by establishment politicians, and by that I mean, in the UK, the Conservative Party, and sadly most of the Liberal Party, and certainly almost all the parliamentary Labour Party. They wish Julian nothing but ill. And were he to pass away in the Ecuadorian embassy, I think that's something I'd be quite happy with. And I say that with a very heavy heart. I don't say that lightly at all. I think Julian's welfare is not of any interest whatsoever to the British establishment. Silencing him is of interest to the British establishment. I should say, while I do definitely have great worries about the long-term deterioration of Julian's health, don't get me wrong, I don't think he's at death's door. I'm not saying that. But undoubtedly, it is becoming quite urgent to resolve this position, because effectively a form of he's suffering much worse confinement than anyone suffers in any jail in the UK. Certainly, the conditions of his confinement are really not bearable, and the new hostility of the Ecuadorian embassy towards him makes that psychologically so much harder to bear.
Right. Well, I am certainly hoping that the start of a sea change in attitudes towards Julian will spiral into something. I think that many, as you said, this viciousness that you described that's come from the legal system and from the establishment certainly has come from the media as well. And a lot of effort was put into degrading the natural support base for Julian over the last some years. And I've seen this year that worm has started to turn, and it's turned from the grassroots. It's turned from events like this where large numbers of high-profile figures are prepared to stand up and say, I support Julian, never mind the smears, I stand with Julian, I'm in solidarity with Julian. And tomorrow we have our first day, we're calling it the Unity for J Day, where cities around the world will be taking decentralized actions in support of Julian. And we intend to push that movement forward and to grow it for as long as possible, as long as necessary. So I do have some element of hope there, though I agree with you that they have no care or concern for Julian, the establishment. I think if we can make them feel the fire on their own backsides, then that is the point at which some things might change.
Yeah, I think as well, Once the issues get into proper court hearings in the United States in particular, where Julian, once legal process moves forward and it becomes plain, what we all know is happening in secret, the establishment likes to pretend isn't happening, which is this plan to arrest and prosecute Julian for publishing, in effect, for being an editor. That there will come a time when the academics and journalists in the United States who have done nothing realize the threat this poses to themselves. And at that stage, we may see them turning a bit.
I certainly hope so. Thank you so much, Craig, for being here and for sharing your experience with us and your wisdom. I deeply appreciate it. It's been wonderful to have you, and we certainly will be in contact again.
Yeah, no, thank you. And let me give, I should say, I think the tweets that have been going out showing people actions they can take tomorrow have been absolutely brilliant. And I do hope it'll be all around the world. And I'm sorry if I sounded slightly depressed then. I worry about Julian a lot, and I worry about the future. But undoubtedly, the more pressure people can put, the better. And I do urge people to get out there and support the fantastic actions that are going to go on tomorrow.
I certainly understand the element of realism, because we've seen so many heroic figures like Julian be persecuted and not to good ends, you know, throughout history. However, I feel that's even more reason why we have to try to intervene in that process. And particularly in the case of Julian, as I keep saying, he's someone who has saved the lives of other whistleblowers, saved the lives of at-risk journalists and truth tellers, asylum seekers, thinking of Amin Husseinov, not just the Snowden case, but other cases as well where Julian has intervened and saved lives. And I think it's of critical importance that we save his life. So thank you so much for being here and for your support for this movement.
Thank you, Susie. Bye.
Bye-bye.